You know, I often think that I was very lucky that I was the age I was, and that I didn't have to make decisions for myself. Because I was only 14, I mean, I was not a child, not an adult, I was a very young teenager, but I don't know what decision I would have made, what options I had. But 4 months after the liberation, Sweden offered to take some children, but also adults. Actually, Sweden was wonderful because they were helping, even during the war. They were rescuing people from camps, concentration camps, and they were exchanging them for lorries or something for the Germans, but they were actually, you know, saving lives. And after the war, they immediately started accepting refugees. They invited them to come, they wanted to help. And I went there with a group of children in July 1945, and I was very, we were very well received, and our life was that we were in what you could call in normal times boarding school, but we were all survivors. And of course we all spoke different languages, but we overcame everything. We were learning quite a lot, and we were sort of helping in this large home where we were. And we were searching for relatives to see who survived. And my cousin Anne, who then was separated from me, because you wouldn't put a 7-year-old with a 14-year-old, not for learning purposes. So, but you know, it was amazing. She actually didn't mind. As soon as the war finished, she kind of shed that fear that she had all through the war. She was a different child. And we were in touch, we were writing to one another, but she was in a different place from me. And in fact, only recently I got a very unexpected email with lots of photographs with somebody, one of the people a couple who looked after the children in one of these homes in Sweden. His grandparents looked after the children. He's the grandson who's taken a great interest in that history, and he's sort of contacted people. And I've actually got a lot of photographs of my cousin Anne that I found among all these. So we were there, and at that time I found that my brother had survived. In the meantime, he found that I had survived. And my brother came to England with a group of children. And that's a really interesting story, which is being now I can't pronounce that word, but it is being now, it's a subject of an exhibition in Windermere. The government here gave permission for 1,000 children to come over from the camps. In the event, but they only gave permission and nothing else, because these children had to be guaranteed and looked after by an independent body. The government didn't make any contribution to that. There was no government help for any refugees in those days. And it was a Jewish organization called the Central British Fund, which we used to call CBF, and they still exist, but they've changed their name to World Jewish Relief. And so in the event, they couldn't even find 1,000 children. Very few children survived. And they brought over 722 children. They brought them over in 1945 in the summer in groups of a few hundred. Like my brother was in a group of 300 children. They came over in bomber planes, not civilian planes. They were sort of just on the ground sitting there being taken to England, well in fact to Scotland, because they landed in Carlisle. and my brother was a group that ended up in Windermere. Now, in Windermere, during the war, they had a factory. Again, it wasn't just a small factory, it was a very big place, where they made the flying boats. Has anybody heard of those? Because they played a great part during the war in saving us all. But after the war, and actually that place was bombed out in somewhere near London, and they took the production to Windermere. So after the war, that stopped, and they had all the accommodation there for the workers and some for the families. So they took one group of boys there. And it was only in the last few years, some of the people who remembered these boys, they say boys, but there were girls among them, but they were mostly boys. And the older people remembered them, and they wanted to sort of have some sort of remembrance of these boys. So they set up an exhibition, which is a permanent exhibition, and they're actually going to build, they've got very ambitious plans. And we met the men in charge, and what impressed me so much, we were actually going, I was going with my companion we were going to Windermere, and by chance, to a meeting, and he said, we met this man at a dinner, and he came to London, and he said, well, when you come, I must, I'll show you around. And the way he put it to us was, well, I'll show you where they were. Now, I'll show you where they went swimming in the lake. I'll show you which school they went to. And I'll show you the cinema they went to. And we encouraged them to go because that was one way of learning the language as well, quickly. And I was just so impressed. I said, what made you, to sort of keep this memories, made it important there? And they said, it is part of our history. Anyway, so that's where my brother went. But by the time, and when we found each other, arrangements were made for me to leave Sweden and come to England to be reunited with him. But by the time I came, he was living in London, and he was living in a hostel. I was living in lodgings, and so we weren't really, I mean, we were still brother and sister, but we weren't living as a family. We had been separated for a long time by then. And we were only reunited in 1947, which was quite a long time after we were separated. And then, so when I came here, my first priority was to learn the language and some skill to earn my own living. I was looked after this organization as well. They were absolutely wonderful. And I was living in lodgings. I was doing a secretarial course, and within 1 year, I was self-supporting. I was only 16 when I came here. And I was self-supporting. My first job, I earned £4 a week. Don't laugh, but it was possible to live on £4, but only if you weren't too demanding. But I managed, I didn't complain. And then I started going out to clubs and organizations, and I had a social life. And in one of these places I met my husband-to-be, who was, I met this handsome young man who was called up during the war. Now, he served in the forces. He was in the engineers, Royal Engineers, and he saw some very terrible battles in the front line in North Africa and Italy. And he was only demobbed in 1947. He used to say, oh, I came to England the same time as Mama. I mean, he was demobbed from the army. I had come from a different place, but Well, we got married in 1950, and I've got 2 children, a girl and a boy, and 3 grandchildren, and that's really my history in a nutshell, my post-war history. Yes, I heard it not. I did hear about it. It's quite an amazing, a terrible story, isn't it? And in fact, I had read it up. I wasn't in any way sort of connected to it. I didn't know. We weren't there very long. And of course, my age, I wasn't really an adult. I wasn't a child and I wasn't an adult. I did know about the experiments, but I've really got to know the details much better since I've been reading about it. Yeah. Well, you know, I don't have very strong views on any of these things, because I mean, I'm trying to think, not what I think now, but what did I think then? And I hardly knew what was going on outside. But I think the consensus among the survivors is that they should have bombed at least the railway lines, so it couldn't get people to the camp. But I suppose I'm reluctant to blame them for anything, because the Allies were fighting a very terrible war, and they were doing their best. The decisions probably weren't always the correct ones, but we're talking from hindsight. We can tell them that. You know, we said we don't know how much they knew. Of course, they knew much more than they let on, but they were preoccupied with the big picture. They didn't look at the small picture. And of course, everybody was equally horrified when they did get to know the reality of what it really was. But then it was too late. And yes, they should have bombed it, but I'm not holding it against them that they didn't. You know, one never comes to terms with it. One just lives with it. And, you know, if people are lucky enough to have a good life afterwards, and my own view is that if people were young enough, I put down my own situation. I think, because I was young, I think children are more flexible, and they're able to adapt, and they're somehow able to overcome things. And so I have returned to normal life, but having said that, you're never free of what you've been through, and you're never free of the loss. And it doesn't get better, actually it gets worse when you get older. But people have made their lives. I mean, it's very difficult to explain, and because I give the impression that I'm very relaxed, and I don't worry, and I'm okay, and everybody admires this and that, and after what you've been through. But the fact is, I don't normally say this, but the fact is that what I feel inside, I don't always show. And one never gets over those sort of traumatic scenes. And of course, one of the most important things, there was an advantage and there is a disadvantage. I have this view that children fared better because they were young enough to overcome it. But there's the other side to it. Some people feel, and I'm not sure that they're not the right, children, it affected the children worse, because their minds, their psychology is just forming, and when you're exposed to these sort of situations, can't possibly do you any good, can only harm you. So I don't know, and the fact that every person is different, unless they actually make a study of it with statistics. So many people responded like this and so many like that. I don't know of any such studies. So it's all speculation. But when you think about children, take me as an example. I was going through it between the ages of, say 9, I was nearly 9 to 14. Those were my formative years. And I needed nutrition, certainly. That's when a child grows. I didn't have that. I needed parental love and care, and I didn't have that. I only had it to the age of 12, and that was it. That's not long enough. And even that, the last 3 years of that, the 12, where I was already going through terrible things, even though my parents were around still. I didn't have any schooling. I'm not talking about education, but just ordinary school. And, you know, I didn't have the most important thing one needed at my age. Yet, I have come out of it. And I have, in fact, got a degree in sociology. But I did it through my own efforts because when my children were old enough and they went to school, I went to classes. They were like evening classes, but they were during the day, they weren't in the evening. And I got 2 A-levels and 5 O-levels. Now, I don't know if you know what O-levels are. They don't have them today, but you might still know about them. So I had qualifications for university. And it was my daughter, who was already quite grown up. She was 16 or 18. And she found me a course in London University. And I did sociology, but it was very hard because there's certain basic, ordinary things that if you miss them in your childhood and your young years, you never catch up on them. And when you go along in life, they are missing. You do learn them, but only by chance. But you know, there's certain times for learning certain things. I know old people study and all that, that's wonderful, always extras, but you never make up for those formative years. That's very interesting because I'm often asked, when did you tell the children? And I've got a friend, a survivor, with an extremely interesting story. When people say to her, when did you tell the children? She says, I didn't. And that applies to me because I never actually sat them down and told them. But they found out, you know, children have a way of finding things out. And it's amazing. And I only found out comparatively recently that my daughter was reading so many books on the Holocaust when she was young, well, in her teens. But I didn't know about it. So she was really quite well informed, and she, you know, things come out. But I never sort of told my story, but there were little bits here and there, and no one ever asked me. And the interesting thing is that people didn't talk about the Holocaust. Apart from family, it's within the family, it wasn't talked about. And why didn't they talk about it? Anybody like to say something on it? Or perhaps because you haven't actually studied it, you wouldn't come across it. Well, the fact is that when I came to England, people didn't, I knew a lot of survivors because I came into that group, that we had a club, the Primrose Club, and we used to meet, and lots of other people used to come in who weren't survivors, and they loved coming to this club. And a lot of them married, so couples married. Survivors rarely married one another, they always married someone else somehow. And what was it I was going to tell you? Sorry. I've completely lost my trend because I'm going down. Yeah, well, we didn't talk about it. And I've got my own theory, but that's what I think. Somebody may think otherwise, but after the war, Britain had also been through a war. They weren't invaded, luckily, but still they were fighting a war. There was bombing, there was shortages, and after the war, they were rebuilding their life. The survivors were rebuilding their life. The British, they were rebuilding Britain. There was a lot going on. It wasn't a time for talking. And there's actually a biblical saying that there's a time for everything. There's a time to speak, and there's a time to keep quiet, and it goes through various things like that. And that wasn't the time to speak after the war. Then the interest started, but it developed very slowly, and when the Holocaust went onto the curriculum, and every school is learning about the Holocaust, that's when it sort of became much more, people became interested. And of course now the interest has somehow gained momentum, and there just aren't, you see, there's more interest and less speakers. So the demand is gone up and the supply is going down inevitably. So we're there, but the whole thing developed in a sort of quite interesting way. It's something I'm sure all the many people who study it would write about it. Or the Dutch children. It's an amazing story because these were the children of the diamond workers. Their fathers worked on the diamond, in the diamond bourse in Amsterdam. And they got to the workers when they invaded, the Nazis, and they wanted to know what happened to the diamonds. And they wouldn't tell them. I don't know whether they didn't know or whether they didn't want to tell them. But they didn't tell them, and they threatened that they would deport them if they didn't tell them. And they didn't, so they were deported at first to, I just had the word, it's a camp it was a camp in Holland, Westerbork. They were deported, it was a sort of holding camp, and from there they were deporting them further. Well, there again they asked them and they didn't tell them. So they threatened to deport them to a concentration camp. And they deported them to Bergen-Belsen, and they were kept actually in a separate barracks. It was called the Familien barracks, meaning the family barracks. So there were parents with their children. There's actually a book about it. One of these, the girls, Hattie, who was a friend of mine, has written a very interesting book. It's called The Children's House in Belsen. And so they deported them there. Then they started threatening them again about where the diamonds are. And they didn't tell them, so they deported all the fathers. And out of those, very few people came, just a handful of men came back. They deported them to Auschwitz from Bergen-Belsen. Then they started on the mothers, and they deported them. And finally, there were just the children left on their own. And they decided that they were going to, they didn't know what they were going to do with them. So they loaded them onto a lorry and took them outside the camp. And they were driving around. They were supposed to get rid of them, apparently. I'm not very clear about that part of the story because the children who survived, most of them survived. Actually, I was with them when they were telling, and everybody had some different idea that it happened this way or that way. The Dutch children's German was very good, and they could hear them arguing about what to do with the children. They were going round and round, and eventually some they were supposed to shoot them outside, and others wouldn't let them. Anyway, they went back into the camp, and they set the children off in a sort of square somewhere. And the children were there on their own, crying. The youngest was only a few months old, and the oldest was my age. She's 6 months old, and she was the eldest. And some women in the barracks heard the children and went out to help. And they were, the woman who went out, Sister Luba, and sister, we called them sister, it was Luba and Hermina, and they saw these children, they wanted to help them, they didn't know what to do with them, they took them into their barracks. But there was another woman there who was a doctor, who worked in the hospital, and was able to speak to the doctor there, I can't remember his name, or was it the commandant, and they actually said that they'll allow a whole barracks just for the children. So it was all started by Sister Luba and Dr. Bimko, and they took the children there, and it became a sort of proper, not really proper, but a kind of children's home. And they enlisted the help of other women, and they look after the children, and they cared for them. They used to go to the kitchens and beg for more food, and the children were sort of that much better off. And after the war, some of the mothers survived, very few of the fathers survived, so most of those children were really orphaned once the war was finished. Oh, I honestly don't know. We always talked about the SS. When we talked about them, we talked about the Gestapo and the SS. We never talked about the Wehrmacht. I think the Wehrmacht, I don't know the different groups in the army, but the Wehrmacht would have been probably engaged in the real army matters. But I just wanted to tell you about these boys. They were not all boys, but the boys and girls. There's actually a book called The Boys, and it's been written by Sir Martin Gilbert, who is a very distinguished British historian. He's written the Churchill biographies, and he was very interested in the boys, and so there is the book. And a lot of interest in them because people wanted to see, well, you know, how did these people fare after the war and how did they rebuild their lives? And there isn't actually a book that after the first book, The Boys, but they have looked at sort of what contribution they made to the country they live in, to society, and they've got quite a good record. But speaking on a sort of more personal level, my brother was always a very keen sportsman, and he was good at all sport. It was just sort of, he just liked it. He took after my father. And he was playing football, and he was running and swimming and everything else. But one day he saw some people, he was on Hampstead Heath by the lake, and he saw some people doing weightlifting, and he thought, I'd like to try that. And he asked the man in charge, and he said, well, we don't really like people doing it, you sure you can? He said, well, can I just try? And when he saw him lift the weights, he said, have you ever done it before? He said, no. He said, you seem to be a natural at it. Come to my classes, you know, I'll take you on, come to the, you know, to the group. And my brother ended up representing Great Britain at the Olympics twice. Once in 1956 in Melbourne and 1960 in Rome. And there was another one, I don't know if it was before or after, but that he was supposed to attend, but he became ill, he had an operation and he couldn't go. But he represented them twice. So that was quite an achievement. And he was so popular in his group that they chose him as the captain of that team. And when they, you know how they walk into the stadium on the opening night, and there was my brother with the British flag. And, you know, it was all very moving. And he achieved an awful lot, but, well, he was actually interviewed on Desert Island Discs, if you ever want to listen to it. And he was saying how, yes, his parents would have been so proud of him, but they weren't there to be proud. So. Well, you know, some of the Poles, I know they did help. I mean, the perception is, and most of it is true, that they were very anti-Semitic, and they did actually betray, they turned in Jews. But we must never forget that they did also save Jews. And the Jews are very aware of it, they recognize it, and these people have been actually recognized at the Yad Vashem, which is the Jewish museum in Israel. They've got actually a very long avenue of the righteous Gentiles. And anybody who is helped is being recognized and really feted. And so they weren't all bad, but on the other hand, against that, there's some people who turned people in. So you got the mixture, but no. As for the Germans showing remorse, I don't know of anybody who has. I mean, I don't know, but there may be some. I did see a television interview with Primo Levi. Has anybody heard of Primo Levi? The best writer, in my view, on the Holocaust. He was an Italian Jew who was sent to Auschwitz, but because he was an adult and already a qualified chemist, he worked in some of their laboratories, and he was actually treated better. But he worked with Germans, and he wasn't treated too badly. He was important because he was contributing to them. And after the war, in this interview, he said that he got a letter from this doctor, I think it was Miller, I can't remember the name because I watched it many, many years ago, more than 20, probably 30. And I haven't got the recording anyway, it was someone lent it to me. So he received a letter from this German doctor who worked with him, and to say he would, first of all, he asked for his forgiveness. And he also said that he wanted to meet him. He would love him, he would travel to Italy. Would he grant him a sort of meeting So he wrote back to say, well, as for forgiving, who is he to forgive? He survived. The people you want to ask are not there to ask. So I can't forgive for other people. But this man said, well, I would really like to come and see. I've travelled to Italy. And he was supposed to come, but in the meantime he had a car accident, he was killed, and that was the end of that. But of course after that, Primo Levi, who to me was the most rational, clever, amazing, lovely man, he committed suicide. And I just can't come to terms with that. I thought, how can a man like that kill himself? But apparently he did, unless he was pushed. He became, he fell down the stairwell. So, but if anybody wants to read about the Holocaust, I really recommend Primo Levi. The book is called If This Is a Man. And because now they're much more sophisticated books with all different views, and the research has been done. But he wrote this straight after the war, and he described what he saw in the camp, what was happening. But he did it in a way that was just very non-judgmental, it was done in a way that I really admire, because now they're much more sophisticated works with research behind it and so on. But I still think that Primo Levi, for me, is the top, the best writer. But that's, I'm always asked. There's one other thing I want to tell you because no one asks. But I'll answer yours first, Judaism. People wonder if I've lost my faith because of what happened. And the fact is that I didn't give it much thought at the time. There's this perception that, well, if God's let you down, how can you still believe? And that's true on the face of it. But I was too young to really understand religion anyway. I only knew what I was told. I knew I had to behave because I'd be punished by God if I didn't. And I saw there was a big man with a white beard sitting up there watching me. So I didn't really know that much about religion. But after the war, I actually, once I got married, I do keep a Jewish home. I follow the Jewish religion because Judaism is important to me. The Jewish people as a people are important. I don't have much time for the minutiae of observance of the religion, because we have some very strict laws in the Jewish religion about not driving on the Sabbath, and I don't know if you're Jewish yourself and you know about this, but I was born Jewish, I always will be Jewish, it's important to me. And what I like about Judaism is that it is a religion that's very family orientated. And apart from the bits that you do in synagogue, when you come home, it is the festivals are always celebrated round a dinner table with the family around, special foods for special occasions, and it is a sort of religion. I think it's enjoyable. So I am, I'm Jewish, I'm practicing, but not to the extreme. I'm just a middle of the road Jew. And the other thing, if no one is going to ask, I want to tell you, people always say, do you hate the Germans? I always think I do, wouldn't you? But there is a distinction between those perpetrators and the Germans of today. And I really want it to be known that I don't have anything against the successive generations of Germans, but the perpetrators I do hate. I'll never forgive them. But I have nothing against Germany and the ordinary people of today.